On this episode of the show, I have with me Sadi Khan. He is the co-founder and CEO of Aven. And we're going to be talking about, well, where innovation and impact are really going to benefit people. And in this case, we're going to be talking about something everyone deals with on a daily basis. It's really the cost of capital. And we're going to ask him about what that means, what the company's building. And we're going to talk a little bit about the technical challenges and how does success get measured in a fast-growing startup. I'm really excited to have you on the show, so I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Amir. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you and chat about Aven and the products we're building and how we measure success.
So why don't you tell us what you guys do at Aven?
Yeah. Amir, Aven's mission is to help reduce the cost of capital for consumers in the world. We started in the US, where we have almost $1 trillion of credit card debt, which is roughly translates to about $200 billion of interest payments per year. And our mission at Aven is to drop that in half. Our flagship product that we built about 4 years ago, which is the Aven Home Equity Credit Card, which is a credit card that's a HELOC in the back and a credit card in the front, with the mission to be the lowest interest rate credit card in the world. We launched it about 4.5 years ago, and it's been growing tremendously. And now we're expanding and rolling out a suite of products for every homeowner in America so that we can serve every financial need that they have.
Absolutely. Very interesting. And we'll definitely get into what technology is enabling some of this innovation as well. I guess, and people can obviously take a look at your background. You've worked for some fantastic companies. When or how did this become the mission? Like, when did you realize that this is a problem that you want to solve and you're the right person to solve it?
Yeah, ironically, I didn't think I was the right person to solve it for some time, actually. So we can go into that. I left Facebook about 7.5 years ago with the goal of retiring, transparently, and taking time off and spending time with my family. I had a hard time making that stick. It turns out that, I think many of us, we like to have, really hard, big problems to work on all the time. And I think not having a big, hard problem to work on leaves like this big kind of emptiness in you in some way, shape, or form. And I know this may sound a little bit weird, but I actually think it wasn't even good for my mental health to not be working on something, significant. And so I started looking at different things to work on. And the kind of core thing I stumbled upon is that I think most of us in society want to work on helping others. And the two ways I think that we can all try and help others is to try and help people be healthier and try to help people be wealthier, was kind of my theory that I developed at this time. And so this was actually, not as commonly known, but I actually had two different decks that I had built during this time that I was retired on, two different types of products / companies to build. One was what is today Aven, and the other one was actually around primary healthcare, which I think there is an enormous need in primary healthcare. It's extremely inefficient. It's actually quite expensive in aggregate. And how could you make primary healthcare better was my other passion. And I actually spent, ironically, potentially even more time on that deck than I did on what the deck is today at Aven. But through a series of circumstances, I became more excited about building, Aven. And in fact, after the deck was built and I was talking to a lot of people during this time, I actually tried to hire 4 or 5 other people to be the CEO of the company initially. And my goal was not to be the CEO of Aven originally. And I talked to, I think, 5 people actually, and tried to, convince them / interview them. And of the 5 people I spoke with, like 4 of them were not great fits, in my opinion, to do this, for a multitude of reasons. But one of the most important things is I believe that this is really hard to do and hard to do really well. And the 4 people that I talked to, of the 5, I don't think were, either like smart enough or hardworking enough to do this. And then the 5th person thought I wasn't smart enough to do this. And so, they were like, you shouldn't be involved in this. You shouldn't do this. And I couldn't convince this person to join this company because he thought it was a bad idea, which is reasonable, in my opinion, from at that time. And so I was left with the lack of choices, frankly. And so then it was like, well, shit, I got to do this myself. And that's how I ended up being the CEO of the company. And since then, I think I've realized that, there is some truth to the notion of like, product / domain and founder fit. And I do think, this fits me well, and I'm happy to do it. And I'm, grateful for the opportunity to be able to contribute to our mission. The mission is something I'm very passionate about. I stumbled upon this problem actually by reading. There are two graphs actually. One graph was this graph which showed that the total interest being accumulated by US consumers was growing at this almost monotonic clip over like a 75-year period, where it went from zero to about $1 trillion where it stands today currently, a little bit over $1 trillion in fact. And there was another graph. They weren't overlaid, and we, when I was building our deck, I actually overlaid them, but there were two separate graphs. One was this, the total cumulative credit card debt had just been going up and to the right for 75 years since the advent of credit cards. And the other graph was that the cost of that capital, the cost of that credit card debt had actually not changed in almost 75 years. So during that 75-year period, that interest rate on that credit card debt that had gone from zero to $1 trillion had roughly hovered between 20 to 25% for this entirety of this period. And during this time, Amir, we've literally invented the internet. We've gone to the moon. We've built all the major tech companies that we know of, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Apple. And we haven't actually made that much meaningful progress in reducing the cost of capital for consumers. And that felt off, right? That felt like we should be able to do something here. And so I started looking into it. And I found this really interesting statistic that a huge amount of that credit card debt, that $1 trillion of credit card debt, actually sits in prime and super prime customers. So, a lot of people, even in the early days of us, talking about Aven to employees and investors and co-founders, they would be shocked to find out that $750 billion of that $1 trillion of credit card debt actually sits in prime and super prime customers. Not in kind of our, perhaps mental model of like those in deep need or in deep, low FICOs and low subprime kind of populations. They're actually people in the 700, 750 FICO ranges hold an enormous amount of that credit card debt. Once I tell you why, it'll be kind of obvious. It's because nobody is giving low FICO customers access to credit card debt, so they don't have as much, ability to borrow. But most of the debt sits in actually prime and super prime. And as you probably already know, that a huge amount of that debt sits in prime and super prime customers who actually own assets. So 60 to 70% of homeowners today that have home equity, there's something like over $30 trillion of home equity in the market right now, are actually sitting on credit card debt. That is, between 20 to 30% interest rate. In fact, on average, I think the last time we checked, it was about 24.99% interest rate, which is bananas when the average home equity interest rate is closer to 10% right now in the market. And the average amount of credit card debt that folks have is between $5,000 to $10,000, which is a very meaningful amount, right? And so these kind of statistics, when you layer them on top of each other, kind of go, well, this is A, crazy that we have this problem that we haven't made that much progress on, and B, we have like kind of a solution staring at us in the face. Well, why isn't everyone doing this? Why aren't we able to use assets that we own to reduce our effective cost of capital as a consumer and get credit for what we own? And that, ended up being kind of the conclusion of why to build Aven is we think there is transactional inefficiency in there. It is like difficult and cumbersome and expensive to actually get access to these assets that you own. And so to get access to home equity, it takes about 30 days to get access to a home equity line of credit. And it actually costs thousands of dollars for the lender to give you that access, actually. It's not even the lender, lenders being bad or trying to skim off the top. No, it's just expensive. The origination process is so inefficient that it costs a lot of money for them to give you access to home equity, which does two things. One is most consumers don't want to go through all this hassle of getting access to their home equity. And B, most banks don't want to give you home equity lines of credit that are smaller than $40,000, $50,000 because it's too expensive for them and they don't make enough money on the interest rate to make it profitable for them. We're technologists, like you come from a technical background, you're telling me how you've been an engineer in the past, so you know that as technologists, our goal is to make things efficient. That's really what we do as engineers, right? We draw up the transaction inefficiency in systems, whether it be helping you get rides in people's cars like Uber, or stay in people's homes like Airbnb, or communicate with your long tail of friends like Facebook and Instagram. Like in the history of technology, our kind of our work or contribution to society is to like reduce transactional inefficiency. And so this felt like a engineering class problem, effectively. And to be very transparent, we also didn't think of ourselves as like incredibly knowledgeable or experts in credit underwriting. And so we knew that we would have to kind of, get help and get better on that front. But the place where we think we could uniquely contribute is that efficiency. And so we built, we started off with a goal of trying to get the home equity process down to 5 minutes. That was my goal originally, actually, when I started the company. So very technically, I have not yet succeeded, and we're still working on it. And so we got it down to as fast as 15 minutes for a lot of people, not for everyone. And we continue to strive to make that, better and better for more people, and make it faster and faster for the best people that we can get through in a rapid way. And we had to invent, to your earlier question, a lot of different interesting pieces of technology to make that happen. I think we talked about, fax machines to help us do income verification that are like running on servers, all the way down to like robot arms that hold pens that can execute wet signatures that help us close these mortgage deeds of trust entirely from your phone. And we hold the only patents around remote wet signature process in the United States that we've been able to deploy in production in the United States. And so, yeah, it's been a journey, and we're grateful for all the customers that have believed in us and have become our customers and stayed with us for many years. And we're growing every day, and it's been wonderful to see us helping customers save money. I think there's an interesting question you asked in the beginning of like trying to think about what is our metric for success. And for us at Aven, every week we review one dash that tracks how much money have we saved consumers. Mm-hmm. And we've been able to cross $200 million a couple of months ago, and we're tracking it obviously every week, and it continues to go up and to the right, and we're really proud of that. And that's our North Star. That's why we started the company. That's why we'll continue to run the company. And I think we will always strive to drive that to be at the highest possible slope and the highest possible, absolute value as much as we can. And, the way we think about it is if we are successful, Amir, then we should be able to have reduced the cost of capital by about 50% for the US consumer, which will be the single largest drop in the cost of capital in American history, and actually in the history of credit cards globally. And that's what we're striving to do, and we think that's a mission worth working on for a very long time.
That's a fantastic story of how you actually want to solve a problem that, as you were speaking, I was thinking about, all the people that are saddled with credit card debt. They make minimum payments. They can never get out of the cycle. Yeah. There's whole industries to help people get out of this interest rate cycle of debt. I guess when you looked at this problem, you come from technology. From your perspective, and obviously, maybe a few questions. Maybe before I ask you about the technology, what prevents all these other, well-capitalized lending arms to do something similar? It might not be in their best interest because charging 25% seems pretty darn good, but is it a case of it's just too good of a business model to want to disrupt yourself and innovate, and you do want to get, keep people in that cycle, or, are you seeing something different of why other people have not innovated into the space like the way you are?
Yeah, I think people have tried to be transparent. I think like Capital One actually tried to build this exact product about 20, 25 years ago. And so we in fact hired some consultants who had worked on that team to help us learn about where they succeeded and what worked well and what didn't. And they, told us that the credit performance of this test that they ran was actually really strong, but the origination costs were too high and they couldn't make the economics work, which is exactly our theory of why this doesn't work and what we could incrementally contribute to solving this problem in the world. And so the kind of core challenge here for everyone who's trying to build this is being, how do you actually originate a home equity line of credit in a really short period of time and a small amount of cost? And the reason for this is there's just a lot more overhead to originate a home equity line of credit than a traditional personal loan or unsecured credit card. For example, one is required by law and frankly, ethically, to verify someone's income as part of a home equity line of credit. And so income verification is not done in any credit card process today. We're the only credit card company that actually, as far as I know, that actually does income verification for a consumer, where every single consumer on the Aven portfolio must verify the income through some third-party source. And we, build a lot of technology, to your point, to do that very efficiently. A home equity line of credit must also be notarized with a wet signature in certain counties. You need to have a notary team that's notarizing documents instantaneously. You must have supply demand curves matching on the notarization process. You have to build a video audio stack that needs to be certified by a MISMO that gets audited every n number of months. So there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to get that needs to be built to do this. And that stuff is just expensive and it's hard and it's gnarly engineering. Let me tell you something really simple that sounds like so obvious, but is actually really challenging technically, is name matching. So when you apply for a credit card, you put in your name, you put in your date of birth, you put in your address, and it goes to the bureau and it pulls out your credit file, and Capital One or your favorite credit card company is able to look up your credit history and go yes or no, right? And can make a decision fairly quickly. But for example, when you're applying for a home equity line of credit, we need to look at your name, and we need to make sure that name is the same name that's on actually the county record for your deed of trust for the lien on the home. So those names need to match. And then, unlike a traditional credit card company, you actually need to notarize with us. So you need to show up with an ID, with a driver's license, let's say. And that name on the driver's license also needs to match the name you put in and match the name that's on the title. And this may sound like, well, why is that so hard? But turns out it's actually really hard when you think about all the different little weird edge cases that a human like me and you can quickly look at and say, Tom Jackson the first, Roman numeral 1 is same as Tom Jackson the first, Arabic numeral 1. Right? That's pretty obvious to us. But to a machine, that's not obvious at all. Tom Jackson Jr. is actually very different from Tom Jackson Sr. And we need to make sure that someone who comes in with Tom Jackson Senior ID doesn't go and get a home equity line of credit against Tom Jackson Jr.'s home, et cetera, et cetera. So our code needs to handle almost 500,000 permutations of name matches for it to effectively do this computationally without a human having to kind of review every single one. And so these things kind of really add up in the cost structure of this origination. And so we were able to make the origination a lot faster and a lot cheaper by kind of holding ourselves to the kind of same standards of a traditional home equity line of credit origination process, but making it way more efficient, basically. And this allowed us to then kind of do this. And I think other companies have tried, maybe not as hard as they would have if their other business model was not making as much money, to your point. But it is not necessarily from a lack of attempting it. It's just really hard to do. And then the other side of the equation is that we do make less money per dollar borrowed per customer than a traditional credit card, right? The traditional credit card will charge 25% interest rate. And let's say their cost of funds and their risk spread, add up to, I don't know, 10 to 15 minutes. So they operate on a higher NIM spread usually than, a HELOC business. So HELOCs generally tend to operate at a tighter NIM spread. But the kind of upside for our company and our product is that turns out we hold much higher balances per account holder, and we tend to operate with much lower risk or credit risk than a traditional credit card, obviously. So those two things end up combining to give us, similar if not better characteristics financially as a company and as a product. The traditional metrics like return on equity and kind of LTV to CAC and 5-year LTVs tend to be quite competitive in the product. Not because of higher interest rate spreads, but because the balances themselves are more meaningful and large, and our credit risk is a lot lower.
You mentioned, obviously, this has been attempted. It's really hard. And you kind of touched on some of the technical challenges. Trying to do a lot of this, and you mentioned, automating some of the process. When it comes from a technical perspective of what if you look back in the last several years, what is the breakthrough that's enabled you guys to be able to make headway where a Capital One didn't 25 years ago?
100%. I think that's a great question. And I always, when people ask me this, I always tell them, there's a famous tech bro line. I don't know who came up with it, which is, there are no silver bullets. There's only lead bullets. And this is a canonical example of this. Where there is no any one thing, Amir, that, broke the dam for us. It just, we grinded. And, I call this, we're a willpower company. We just exercise willpower against a problem at like a higher level of intensity than almost everybody else. We're willing to stick with the problem longer, and we're willing to work harder than everybody else in the game to achieve this thing. You can debate whether or not we should, but I don't think it's hard to debate whether or not we do. And so I think of this as all like stacking up. There's like 100 little things that we had to do in order to make this efficient. By the way, these are all those things that I talked about earlier, just about the origination process. Mm-hmm. We also have like an extremely creative capital markets team who on the back end needs to create like debt structures that are able to support this product, which are non-traditional. We're one of the first companies ever to do a credit card loan sale receivable that's the fintech. That's not a traditional bank that is issuing credit cards, because credit card receivables have future draws, which make them very hard to do a loan sale on. And so there is like gap accounting rules we need to kind of like push the bounds of around with Deloitte and other kind of auditors to make sure that the treatment is appropriate and correct. And we're following all the kind of like the checks and balances of the financial systems to be able to do so. And so we have to have like very creative capital markets teams that are able to work with the kind of bounds of our problem and build the whole vertical stack. I think Peter Thiel had like this really interesting kind of commentary once, which is there are these certain types of companies which are complex coordination companies. And we are an example of one where, you cannot build this product as like a SaaS layer, B2B SaaS layer that sits and, sells this to banks to originate, because you actually need to kind of invent in every part of the stack, like a fully verticalized pipeline to be able to build, ship, and deploy a product like ours. The good news is when you do so, you're able to build a lot of other innovative products around it. But this, the kind of very kind of compressed form of describing Aven this is a very complex coordination problem. And we have to coordinate across like credit, origination, marketing, and capital markets in a very tight way that is new and inventive, not just at any one point in the stack, but every point in the stack to make a product like this work and come to market at any kind of degree of scale.
Actually, maybe a small step to the side and a question about, you mentioned willpower, should you? And I guess, you can look back now. I don't know if it's always easy to look back, but if we look back, a lot of conversation for founders is that product market fit. It sounded like you identified two different decks. You even had a little bit more passion for a competing idea. You jump into this one. You have the staying power and the willpower to actually drive through and grind through some of these problems, which are very technically, and not just this, one fix solves a lot of problems. Some problem fixes to actually get to where you're at. I guess when you think about founders in general, and you look at product market fit, you stuck to it. You decided potentially not to pivot into an easier lane or a solution that might have been easier to bring to market. A lot of different scenarios we put up there. At the time, what was the thought process? Obviously I know the problem space is something you want to solve, but obviously at some point you do have to have a product you can deliver at some time frame.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually used to joke about this even at Facebook, which is there are, I think, roughly two ways to build products. One way is to take what I call like market risk, and the other way is to take what I call execution risk. So a good example of market risk is trying to build a product like Facebook, where the first version of Facebook was not like the hardest thing in the world to build. Mark, I think, built it in like, let's say, a couple of weeks, and he was able to roll it out. The first version, obviously, the current version of Facebook is very hard to build. But that first version, that first prototype, that first MVP, the risk, though, that was taken was like, well, how many people would want it? How big is the market? Like, how big can this be? And what could it be at the end, right? And that's really hard to tell in the early days of Facebook. Sure, now we can all look back and say, of course, there's like 4 billion people or something on this platform, etc. But like in the early days of building Facebook, I think it's actually really hard to tell how big Facebook could have been. And how many people, frankly, have this problem of needing that can be solved by Facebook. And to me, so that's an example of a company or a product that takes a lot of market risk and doesn't take as much execution risk. You could frankly take most kids out of college and stick them on a lamp stack and they can, whip out today, maybe not back in the day, but these days they can stick up, a lamp stack website that looks somewhat similar to Facebook. The alternative, though, is companies that take what I call execution risk and don't take market risk. A canonical example of this is probably something like Tesla, where, if you were to tell me 25 years ago that I'm going to build a car for you that is going to drive itself, you're never going to have to pay for gas, and it costs roughly the same amount as a very expensive Honda Accord with all the options, let's just say, you'd be like, sign me up, give me 10. Right? And there's no real question that you not want this car. It can drive itself. You never have to pay for gas, and it is a little bit more expensive than a very high-end Honda. You're like, yeah, give me 10 of them. But the question with Tesla was never like, well, if you build this thing, would people want it? The question is always, well, can you actually build this thing? Right? And so I love taking execution risk. I hate taking market risk. I love taking risk on trying to figure out, can we build something when we know if we build this thing, it will be amazing and a lot of people will want it. It's very hard, I think, for people to argue if we show up at your door and tell you, hey, in 15 minutes, entirely from your phone, you can save 50% or more on your monthly interest rate. Like, you should do this. This makes sense. Like, everyone should do this. And I think we see this in our customers. Customers generally love our product and they like taking it. The hard part when we started building Aven was not whether or not we think people wanted it, was whether or not we could build it. And I'm an engineer, so I'm like, that's risk I can take. I love taking that kind of risk. And I love building products where we have gotten to the point where we have defined this to be like structurally and rationally superior to alternatives in the market. And so then the only question remaining is, well, how good are we as engineers? Can we build this thing? And that's something I could work on for a long time. And then the final point I would say is that it is the only problems worth working on are the ones that are worth working on for a very long time. So I think it's like not that interesting to work on problems if you kind of go, you know what, this problem is only worth working on for like a year or two or a few months at most. I'm like very much of the opinion that like you should pick like a problem that you think is so valuable to work on that you're willing to work on it for a decade or two. And hopefully you'll make some traction. But even if you don't, you're like, you know what? That was a problem worth working on for a very long time. And that way you have to be extremely high conviction, in my opinion, on like the problem. And I think you should be extremely high conviction on like an approach to that problem. And I don't think you should start working on something until you have kind of gotten to some pretty high degree of conviction, in my opinion. And that makes it, I think, a lot easier to pick, good problems to work on and to work on them for a very, very long time. Because, I think working on a low conviction problem or a smaller problem or a less important problem is just as hard, frankly, as working on a high conviction, high, importance problem for a long time. They're just equally hard. So you might as well pick one that you're going to be like, you know what, I'm going to work on this for a very, very long time because I'm already high conviction that this is worth it. And I think founders should have extremely high conviction in working on choosing on what they work on. Now, Amir, I haven't worked at that many companies in my life. I worked at Microsoft, I worked at Facebook, and now I work at Aven. I'm a fairly I spend a lot of time thinking about I should go work on this thing. And then I just go work on it for a very, very long time because I think there's so much value you unlock by working on a problem for a very long time. And so I kind of joke with my friends that I always only pick things to work on that I'm willing to work on for the rest of my life. And at the point that I pick, I'm like, okay, this is a thing I can do for the rest of my life, and I would be pretty happy doing so, then I should go do it. And if I can't answer that question as yes, then why am I doing it in the first place? And I think this turns out to be a reasonable strategy. I'm also not a big fan of pivoting. I know that's maybe a bit kind of controversial perhaps sometimes, but I think pivoting is just actually a admission of, and I think it's okay to have to pivot, but you shouldn't start off by expecting to pivot. To me, I think you should spend a lot of time thinking through something before you start, to the point where you're no, I'm reasonably sure this thing is the right thing to go work on. And you could pivot in like your solution to this problem, but you should very rarely pivot the problem. You should have a fairly high conviction on like, this is the problem worth working on, and just like stick to it for a very long time. And if you find yourself moving from problem to problem a lot, my intuition is you probably haven't spent as much time as you should have on like thinking through, is this the right problem to work on?
That's interesting. And maybe last question, I want to maybe continue with that, because I think it does come up a lot with founders about this notion of product market fit. And I feel like there's almost an expectation of, I had an idea conceptually, and I'm going to look to see what the market is going to bear, right? I literally have a problem, I think, and I'm going to keep trying different iterations until there's a solution that the market goes, hey, we pay for that. Mm-hmm. Because what I'm hearing you're telling me is, you thought through the problem space, you thought through the challenges, you weren't sure if you could deliver. That's a whole different question. But you're pretty confident that if you put enough time, you'll potentially come up with a solution. And somebody once told me, it's really important to know where the dead bodies are buried, because everything superficially seems easy. Somebody says, go build this. You're like, okay, so there's machine learning, there's AI, we can do all this stuff. How could it be this hard until you're deep in it? And then you're like, these are the monsters that reach out from the underworld and grab your ankles. But anyways, I guess from that perspective, maybe the last question is, when you think about, and we can talk about from your point of view, you've gone through this, you had this conviction, the actual product itself, when you were actually going through and seeing what you could deliver, and it's so challenging technically, was there a point at which you start wondering whether or not you have to adjust that vision to accordingly deliver a product? Because is it all or nothing of, hey, if I didn't deliver what I intended, I'm just going to close shop and go find a different problem?
I think that's a great question. And absolutely, many times during the build process, I question myself. I think our team questioned ourselves. There are many like hard, dark moments where we're like, man, I don't know if we could do this. Like just very tangibly, when I started, I didn't know that you need a wet signature to close a mortgage deed of trust. I had bought a bunch of real estate, so I kind of knew I signed a document at a title company, or like a notary had come to my office or my home to sign docs. So I knew there was something along that, but I was just like, I'm sure we could DocuSign this thing or notarize.com this thing. And so that was like a very like tangible problem where I didn't know if we could solve it. And we had to figure it out after going like, we're going to solve it. We're going to build this credit card that's going to sit on top of a HELOC. And so we need to originate like what is like legally a HELOC. And that requires a wet signature in a bunch of counties across the United States. And they won't accept it if not. And so that was an example where, it was months of us like banging on this problem and, trying like solution after solution. I think we had 3 different kind of the best real estate law firms in the country on these Zoom calls. And every 24, 48 hours, it was me, our head of design, our CTO, and our legal and compliance team, like banging on this problem. I have this like particular method by which I do this thing, which is, they call it like proof by contradiction with legal teams, where I sit and I have to keep my like foot up on a chair or tool so I can be creative. And then we'd have all these lawyers on the Zoom call, and I would just like pontificate, like, what about if we do this? And why can't we do this? And, one of the firms would be like, well, you can't do this because of this, this, and this reason. And I'd be like, okay, fine. Send us all the details of like why this can't be done with this, this, and that reason. So we'd literally go through like, for example, robot arms for signatures has been an attempted solution to remote signature for a long time, for many years. In fact, Obama signed an executive order using a robot arm from like, I think Hawaii or something. That robot arm is not accepted as a wet signature in Wisconsin. And there's a very specific reason for this, because that has gone through a case where it has been, judged to not be acceptable as a wet signature. And so we literally have to look through like the court cases where like robot arms have been challenged to understand the judge's comments and why specifically that robot arm is not accepted, so we can build something that is acceptable, right? So the level of detail we go to is extremely high on these things. Our patent has to cover things like like all kinds of crazy details that need to be handled to make that like thing work. And so these are things where, yeah, at the time when we were doing it, we didn't know if we could solve it, but we believed there would probably be some kind of technical solution to this problem that we can come to, that would, help us, get close to it. But yeah, there's lots of times when we're like, we don't know how to make this work. The way I think about this is like, there is basically two rough like bounding conditions that you're operating within as a technologist. One is like the laws of physics. Like if you're trying to like, violate some law of physics, like you should stop. Like that's not going to work. You're not going to make like a perpetual energy motion machine. Like that's not a good idea. And so there's, I studied math and physics when I started my college. I ended up in engineering, but there's just laws of physics that you're just not going to violate. So those are pretty good like bounding conditions. If you find yourself hitting a law of physics, then you should just stop right there. And the other bounding condition is what I call like laws of the land, basically regulations. And we, effectively as a company, we do not like taking regulatory risk. And so where there is like unclear regulatory guidance, we tend to step away from those areas broadly and await kind of regulatory clearance. And so we tend to kind of play, if you will, conservatively between like the laws of the land and laws of physics. And those are our two bounding conditions. And as long as we feel we can invent things that sit within those two kind of guardrails, we feel pretty good at like figuring out like a solution to a problem. And that has been like a reasonable approach to kind of say when you should keep going is we're not violating a law of kind of the land and we're not violating any laws of physics.
I love that. Maybe last follow-up, because I know you got to get back to it, but if you would have at some point said, you know what, this wet signature problem is too big. We're just going to hire a bunch of people, whatever the law is, to make them authorized to have a wet signature. I'm sure there's a dynamic there that solves that problem without going to the solution you have. I was thinking about the moat you've created, because the harder the problem, the more time it takes to solve it, the more intricate the solution, the harder it is for somebody to come in and replicate it. Because you alluded to other people having tried this, having failed, why other people might not be interested in it. And here you are, deep into this solution, and you are inventing tech to solve the problem. I feel like there's an interesting correlation here between your defendable moat that you've built and staying with these problems, finding the technical challenges and not saying, hey, you know what, the easier path would have been altering the wet signature requirement so that we just get around it and keep going.
100%. And I think the way we think about it is that, in any given product, there is like, you can boil any given product to like a core set of like, almost what we call like physics components, right? Like when you look at like a credit card, it has like three real axes that matter. It's the interest rate, the rewards, and the line size. If you look at social networks, it's like who's on the network and what content they're publishing, which allows you to consume that other, it's content and people, right, on a social network. So every product or domain in the world can be boiled down to like a set of like kind of atomic axes that operate within it. If you're building a product in any domain, you have to look at that set of atomic axes and go like, this axis is my axis. I'm going to dominate that axis. I have to be the best in the world, that axis. That's the axis I'm going to compete on. And I might compromise on some other axes. I might be like, okay, on these other axes, I'm not going to be as great. And on that one axis that you are like fighting for your life on, I think you have to go like all the way to the edge. You cannot leave anything behind, and I think that's really, really important. And on that axis, you cannot fold at all on the way in. Like you have to just go like, I'm going to go all the way to the edge on that axis and give it everything, because that is your axis. That's the only thing that matters. If that axis is not better by a long margin relative to everybody else, you don't have a product, and then you don't have a company. And I think you have to be kind of laser focused on that axis and give, because you're not going to be the best in everything. So you have to give on the other axis and get like, I'm fine on the other axis. And those axes, you can kind of be the same as everybody else or within like some margin of error as everybody else. But on your core axis, that's your thesis, right? That's your theory of the world. And if that theory is like what you're building your product on or your company on, I think you got to go to 150% on that. And if you can't hit that, then you don't have a product. And I think this is true for any product that one builds, right? Is what is my theory of why this is going to be the best? And then you have to kind of go all the way. And you're right. There are things that we could have compromised on this axis of helping you reduce your cost of capital. But for us, it's the interest rate, right? We must be the lowest interest rate. And that's we got to do everything and anything to help achieve that, as long as it's within the bounds of physics and the bounds of the law. And, our rewards program is fine. Like, we have a pretty good rewards program, but I don't think our rewards program is, as good as, let's say an American Express rewards program or others. We're working on it. We're going to make it better now that we've achieved, like a very high degree of advantage on our core axis. But I don't think we're the best credit card for everyone. We're not as easy to get. We, have like good rewards. We're not like, the best travel rewards card, for example, yet, things like that. But man, we have the lowest interest rate in the world. We have the best cashback in the world on a very good line size. So we're very competitive on those regards. But we're not the best in every regard. And we hold ourselves to a very high bar on the axis that we think is the most important for us as a company and what we think is important for our customers. And we go to the moon for those things. And for everything else, we hold it to like a reasonable standard.
Awesome. Sadi, I appreciate your time. Fantastic discussion, learning more about the company, your approach, philosophies. I'm sure we might be spraying questions about either the product or just something you mentioned on the show. What are good ways of connecting, learning more?
Totally. You can reach out to me, Sadi@aven.com. And you can also just, follow and DM me on Twitter and or LinkedIn. Both I'm reasonably active on. So feel free to reach out to me on either of them.
Brilliant. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining.
Awesome, Amir. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. All right. That's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, we learned quite a bit about how Aven's working and how Sadi's approach to this problem and how he actually has the perseverance to get through it and some of the challenges he had to overcome to actually improving the cost of capital for everyone that could possibly reduce that, and huge benefits of that. So fantastic episode, and please share this with somebody else that might enjoy listening to it. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.